ADD. Adults have it too, and we're going to find out an awful lot more with the expert, Dr. Ron Sterling. Welcome, Dr. Sterling.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate being able to talk about this.
So, I thought that ADD was just a kid's disease, but it's not, huh?
No, it's not. It's a lifelong, essentially genetic-based disorder.
Genetic-based?
Yes.
And the environment doesn't cause it, chemicals in our diet doesn't cause it?
They contribute challenges, for instance, higher data loads in a society where there's a lot of data to be dealt with, like for instance,
what we have today.
What we have now, compared to, let's say, the 1950s. That's a big challenge for the downside of the ADD brain, which is a poor working memory.
So is it an illness, or is it a condition, or neither one of those?
It's a brain type. I don't really think of it as an illness. I mean, it is officially an illness in the DSM, the official guide to diagnoses. But the fact of the matter is, the non-ADD brain has as big a downside as the ADD brain. So,
okay, I don't understand that. What does that mean?
Oh, what is the non-ADD brain?
Yeah, well, what's the difference? I guess it's difference. It's just what is
well,
this
the
all
ADD
about?
brain is clearly at this point in time we understand it to be a brain that has a significant downside called poor working memory, and that poor working memory is compared to a low RAM computer. And that poor working memory comes from poor dopamine function, or suboptimal dopamine function.
And dopamine is?
And dopamine is a neurotransmitter, which is, in my opinion, not a very helpful name for it. It's a bridge system. It is a simple chemical that transfers data between two nerve cells. So it acts as a bridge between two nerve cells to keep the data moving along.
So if somebody's got low dopamine, why can't we just inject people with more?
Because it's very powerful, and large concentrations of dopamine, if you were injecting them, could be problematic, could really cause problems. So it's very subtle. For instance, just fidgeting will increase dopamine enough to increase working memory a little bit. It's not the greatest treatment, but it works.
Huh. By the way, the name of the book is Adult ADD Factbook. It's by Dr. Ron Sterling. It is available on Amazon, and strongly encourage you to read it because it's written at a level that someone like me can understand, and maybe you can too. And heck, I've got a ton of questions. And so let's just get to some of them as well. There's lots of things out there. There's ADD, attention deficit disorder. I know what that one is. There is ADHD, PTSD. I know what that is, I think. PFC, HPA circuit. I have absolutely no idea what these are. Are they all related?
Well, if we're going to be talking about ADD, I really do use the term ADD because it's traditional. Everybody understands the history of that particular diagnosis. You could call it poor working memory syndrome. You could call it a lot of things. A distractibility disorder might even be actually the best name for ADD. But ADHD, there's really no difference in the brain between the downside between an ADD diagnosis or an ADHD diagnosis. Everybody who fits the criteria for ADD has a hyperactive brain. Sometimes it gets translated into behavior, sometimes it doesn't. So it's kind of arbitrary, based on observations, and now we know a little bit more about it, so it's not quite as relevant in terms of the old impulsiveness, impatience, hyperactivity triad. There's much more to it now.
You know, you mentioned it, just now we know a little bit more about it. Before the show we were talking about a 2008 study that's kind of like the big deal. Tell us about that.
So really, since 2008, we know for sure that if you fit fit the criteria, this criteria that was developed for the diagnosis of ADD over the last 40 years, if you fit those criteria, you have got a dopamine dysfunction. In other words, you have suboptimal dopamine functioning. If you don't fit the criteria for ADD, you don't have a dopamine problem. You might have some other problem, but you don't have a dopamine problem.
Can you summarize the criteria?
Yeah, and well, just let me tell you about 2008 a little bit. So
Okay.
2008, the first study that had been in the pipeline for quite a while came out from the NIMH. They have the biggest budget, so they beat everybody to the punch. But it took them a long time to do it, and that's the study that clearly showed what I just said about dopamine function and ADD criteria. So the criteria for ADD has always been pretty much the same for the last 40 years, which is impulsive, impatient, forgetful, distractible, hyperactive can be part of the behavior, fidgety, losing things, sometimes overstructured, sometimes almost can't handle much data, get overwhelmed easily, low frustration tolerance, temper tantrums, and short temper. So all of those criteria relate pretty much, there's only one thing about those criteria that doesn't relate to low working memory, and that's the ability to do risky things without feeling too much of a fear, essentially, or illness, or aversive, you know. In other words, can actually go down certain roads with respect to threat that maybe somebody else who doesn't have a dopamine problem could not do, because they would start to feel sick doing that.
Because you know, I've known people just like what you've described, and I just thought that they just exhibited bad behavior, and I didn't, you know, and I didn't play with them.
Right.
And they're not my friends. So what you're saying is that they may indeed have an illness.
Well, again, illness is a difficult term for me to use as a scientist, because you would tend to think that an illness would be the exception, and the norm would be something that's not an illness, but in a sense, this suboptimal dopamine problem, so to speak, is widespread, and it varies from mild to severe based on how many of your dopamine genes are problematic. So there's 10 different dopamine genes.
Oh.
And when you've got 10 different genes controlling a system of bridges, so to speak, those bridges can be affected in so many different ways. And so you can have one kind of ADD, you might have a dopamine gene problem that's your transporter or your D1 receptor, and I might have a dopamine gene problem that's a D2 receptor, totally different gene. Still, we both have ADD, because it has degraded the dopamine function enough to cross the line to where we have poor working memory.
Wow. Again, the name of the book is Adult ADD Factbook by Dr. Ron Sterling. Dr. Sterling is with us. Let's find out a little bit about you. Has work with ADD and patients of that, has that been your life's work as an MD and as a scientist?
Nope. In a sense, I was a general psychiatrist. I did do a geriatric fellowship at one point in 1999 because I wanted to learn more about geriatric psychiatry. And then I really didn't get into understanding or investigating ADD thoroughly until 2009. And the whole reason I even got into looking at it had nothing to do with my practice. It had much more to do with, I was trying to figure out, well, what's going on with our culture? Because our culture, the United States culture, there's some other cultures that fit the criteria too, but it's essentially the United States culture fits the criteria for the diagnosis of ADD. So what's that all about? That's what I was trying to figure out, and that's what led me down that path.
Is that because that there are so many different stimulation points that are coming our way? I mean, you're watching television, you're on a tablet, you've got the computer going, you've got headphones on, and you're listening to music all at the same time, and you're 10 years old and that's normal.
Yeah, well, that would be how our culture has evolved, right? Because that's the dominant sort of behavior at this point in time. So the question is, why did it go that direction? Well, in a sense, it went that direction because there were these technological advances, so to speak.
But is that bad? Is that bad from a brain standpoint?
But in the same sense, though, it's also overwhelming for people who have difficulty holding a thought for more than a second or two. So poor working memory. Working memory is the same thing as RAM and a computer. Literally the same thing. And working memory in our brains depends upon dopamine. In a computer, RAM depends upon electricity. You turn off the electricity, RAM goes away. If you were writing something to your hard drive when you did that, it wouldn't get written. So essentially what happens in the ADD brain is that poor working memory doesn't allow people to hold a thought long enough to literally make a decision about it, do something with it.
So
it's just streaming data.
In your book, I mean, seriously, Factbook, it doesn't read like a book of facts. It reads actually, it's readable to me. And so I guess I can hold a thought, so I don't have it. But my point here, though...
Well, if you stayed out of trouble, you probably don't have it either. I'm just saying.
I'm not going to say that part. It's basically, if I'm sitting here watching this right now, I want to know, how come you know your stuff?
Oh, how come I know all of this?
Yeah.
Well, like I said, the thing that got me started even studying, and when I get into studying, I can get a little crazy and focused and really go down the road. So I was a biology major and did a lot of scientific research when I was an undergrad, and then went into medicine. So as I was researching our culture, the impulsivity, the impatience, the kind of activities, entertainment culture, so to speak, people aren't saving, people aren't thinking sort of long term, mostly short term. I started going down the road, taking a look at dopamine function, and then I ended up reading about 20,000 pages of primary literature between 2009 and 2011. And that's what went into this book, was that reading. I didn't want to read other people's books too much because those are mostly summaries or their take on research. I was reading primary literature. I think I have about 10 four-drawer cabinets full of it.
Oh my gosh. Again, the name of the book is Adult ADD Factbook. It's by Dr. Ron Sterling. It's available on Amazon. Strongly encourage you, if you have any questions at all, this book is going to allow you to answer a bunch of those questions. One of the big questions that people have is about attention deficit disorder is the difference between children and adults. I mean, people my age, I think, a lot of them think that it's just a children's disease, illness, condition, fill in the blank, but it's not.
Well, so it started out historically with children, and the children were the focus because that's just kind of what people were noticing. And as time has gone on, it's pretty clear that people generally do not grow out of things like forgetfulness and difficulty remembering the beginning of a sentence when they get to the end of a sentence. So reading doesn't necessarily get any better. Certain things can get better, so to speak. People can grow out of hyperactivity. They get more sensitive about people's opinions, so they'll quit fidgeting as much. They'll control it. They'll find workarounds. But since it is primarily related to genetic problems in the dopamine system, it doesn't go away unless you discover some gene therapy. So it manifests in different ways as you grow older, depending on what challenges you bump into. So sometimes people, even with high IQs and poor working memory in college, can bump into the wall, so to speak. Suddenly they can't read as well and and they're noticing they can't read as well, whereas in high school it wasn't so much reading as it was other kinds of activities. That challenge can put them into a place where they start to recognize that they've got some limits that maybe they shouldn't have.
Something that you also talk about in your book is that you're concerned about misdiagnosis. And when I read that, I don't read underdiagnosis, I read overdiagnosis, and then, you know, the medical profession is, sorry to pick on you, but is drugging our people again.
Well, I'll tell you, I'm not going to deny that there's a misuse of medications all over the place, but the issue is, with respect to ADD, is there are other solutions, so to speak, to the population of people who are experiencing the downside of the ADD brain, and it's getting in the way of, you know, success in their particular field, might even be getting in the way of them literally using their IQ as well as they could if they had better working memory. In fact, better working memory guarantees academic success better than IQ. So that study's been done several times. You can have a high IQ, poor working memory. You won't do as well as somebody with an average IQ and better working memory. So working memory is really important, and there's a lot of working memory problems. So the question is there a lot of ADD? Yes, there is. Is it problematic? Only if you're getting in trouble.
Is it cultural, though? I mean, is there more ADD in our population than there would be in a developing country such as Ghana, which is a country that I travel to?
Yeah, so in my book I cover some of this in a lot of detail. The Western Hemisphere has particularly got a high population of dopamine problems. So the whole Western Hemisphere, not just the United States. Officially in South America, they have higher percentage of people with the ADD diagnosis. But unofficially, if you take a look at all of the different things that dopamine problems cause, sleep disorders, smoking, tobacco, alcohol, all of these things are dopamine enhancers, so to speak. It's a large number of people that have dopamine problems. The question is, how do you go about fixing that? Well, if you're getting in trouble as an individual, you don't have too many options besides using something to increase your dopamine. So you could get on a treadmill, but then you can't drive on a treadmill. I'm just saying, there are things that increase dopamine, but they're not efficient or very useful. You can use tobacco to treat your ADD, but it's short acting and it has lots of side effects in the long run, right? Some people learn how to do that. They'll take their afternoon break and suddenly they can crunch numbers better.
So when I'm watching a baseball game and I'm seeing a manager who is chewing gum at 9,000 miles an hour, do I think he's got ADD? If
you're in competitive sports, you're going to be much better at it with ADD than without it.
Really?
Yeah.
Why is that?
So the two parts, now we're getting into some heavy scientific things, more or less. So in terms of ADD, I talk about a clear upside to the ADD brain. Most other people, including experts in the field, are not talking about this particular upside to the ADD brain. Why they're not talking about it, I'm not sure, but it's pretty clear in the literature that the thing that is that ADD folks who fit the criteria for ADD do better than non-ADD people is things like jumping out of airplanes, competitive sports. Anything that has a threat element connected to it, an ADD person will literally get better in that situation, not worse. Because threat, there's a part of the brain that has a bunch of parts, about 22 parts. It's an area of the brain called the Threat Monitor Center. The old name for it is emotional brain. that's still used a lot in the scientific community, and it led to sciences called affective neuroscience, so studying emotional neuroscience. But the threat monitor area of the brain literally senses, monitors all data coming in. All of the data coming in from all of our senses goes through one of those threat monitor circuits for the purpose of keeping us alive, so to speak. Threat monitoring is very important. The person who has the best threat monitoring system will survive.
Huh. So this is fascinating to me because I played basketball for years. I played in college, and at the end of a game, you knew which teammate that you wanted to get the ball to, because that teammate, that player, was likely to put the ball
in the zone.
Yeah.
Yeah. They were in the zone, and that's almost how people who sort of figure this out will describe it, is when they're in that situation where the threat is high, the pressure's on, emergency situations, for instance, for sure, they're suddenly calm, focused, and they can get the job done better than somebody in my tribe, the non-ADD tribe, who end up being shaky, nervous, like the lawyer in Jurassic Park that got eaten by the dinosaur. He froze.
And we all love
froze.
that too.
That's my tribe.
Oh,
we freeze.
It's really interesting that you say that, because I mean, that's what you talk about in athletics, is slowing the game down. That's what Russell Wilson talks about, you know, the Seattle Seahawks quarterback. And here we are in Seattle, and actually we're recording this a week before the Super Bowl. And as we do that, we look at plays like what Richard Sherman made at the end of the NFC Championship game, where all of a sudden he was able to reach his hand up and knock the ball away. Yeah. I mean, we're not saying that Richard Sherman has ADD.
Well, you know, that's the whole problem.
Is that a bad thing if he does?
Here's the thing about the ADD diagnosis, right? So it's currently considered to be a disorder.
Yeah.
When you name something in such a way to only emphasize its downside, its disorder side, without looking at its upside, then you sort of set people up to not want to have it.
Yeah.
If there's no advantage to having it, why would you want to have it? And if you're going to be said to have a disorder or an illness, nobody wants that. The point is, there's so much of an upside to the ADD brain. They make the best first responders. They make the best combat. They make, you know, don't send people like me to war, because we'll come back with PTSD. The ADDer won't. Literally better in threat situations. Threat literally treats ADD. In other words, working memory goes up because the dopamine levels go up.
So it sounds like what you're saying is that we can actually predict who's going to react through dopamine levels.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yeah. I think so. And I think the literature is very clear on it. And if you look at all of the information about people who do perform and don't sort of clutch in situations, it's people who fit the criteria for ADD. They don't want to say they have ADD only because it's currently called a disorder. And what I'm trying to do actually is help people understand that it's not just a downside to the ADD brain.
So if I go in,
huge upside.
Yeah. So if I go in and say, "Hey doc, how about testing my dopamine levels?" You know, and he looks at me and says, "What? Is that what he's going to do?" I mean, are there doctors out there who really understand this like you do?
A few. Not a lot. Unfortunately, this particular information since 2008, the literature, hundreds of studies since 2008, thousands at this point. We know so much about dopamine. We don't know much about serotonin and some of the other neurotransmitters like we do about dopamine, but it's relatively new. If you think about it, 2008, 2014, 6 years. It takes usually the medical community about 10 years to catch up with the scientific literature on things like this. And I think it's going to be happening here in the very near future, where we're going to be thinking about, really, how do we want to deal with this problem in our
But you're saying it's not necessarily a problem.
The problem is that we are essentially setting up our culture to, in a sense, challenge the ADD brain way beyond its capacity for multitasking and paying attention. So we have a distractibility quotient in our society at this point based on all of the different kinds of technology, consumerism, you name it, activities oriented. We're a very activity oriented nation.
Sure.
And so mindfulness isn't really taught. It's being slow. What? We don't want to do that. But essentially, we're challenging a large portion of our population with too much data.
Well, we've got less than 2 minutes to go, and I have about 1,000 questions left, so we're not going to get it all in, that's for sure. But one big question that I do have, and the way I had it set up is that, is ADD curable? And what I'm hearing you say is that that's not really the question.
Sort of. It all depends on how much trouble you're getting in, right? So the high IQ ADDer who has low working memory will tend to stay out of trouble in terms of crime or going down certain roads a little too far, pushing the envelope, you know, you name it, vandalism or whatever. They will tend to not get in trouble because they have a rational safety net, in a sense. They have a higher IQ. Poor working memory and average IQ and below average IQ, those people can get in a lot of trouble because there's no way to sort of appraise their thoughts before they act on it. They can't hold the thought long enough, and there's no rational safety net like IQ. So if you're getting in trouble, yeah, you want to try and fix that. But if you're not getting in trouble, you might only need to use ADD meds, so to speak, to fix your working memory for the tasks that you're not doing so well at. And then when you go skydiving, don't do it medicated. No, I'm serious.
Yeah,
so you don't have to take meds all day, every day. It's not something that's going to fix nerve cells. It's going to add a missing component for the period of time when you need that good working memory. If you don't need, and like I say, you don't want really good dopamine levels if you're used to doing downhill skiing without meds. And the idea that athletes are using ADD meds to enhance performance, if they are, they're doing it because of a misinformation, because they usually it degrades performance.
And with that, we've got to go. There's a lot more information yet to come. Maybe, just maybe, we'll see if we can get Dr. Sterling back. So thank you very much for being with us. Take care.